over the last year or so to see the rhetoric spin up on both sides of the political aisle about this idea that we have a labor shortage, that, is unemployment too low? Is it driving inflation? And of course, each side then has its own set of proposals in response to that. The one thing that both sides say we should do in response to that is increase immigration. And what's so fascinating about that is it is an explicit concession that, as you just said, immigration affects labor markets. One would think that is an extremely obvious and non-controversial statement to make. But in recent decades, there has been this strong push, which I would argue is almost entirely pretextual, from people who, for other reasons, want to support higher levels of legal immigration and just open borders and a failure to enforce the law generally. There's this push to say, no, immigration doesn't affect the labor market. In fact, it doesn't do anything to the wages of especially lower wage workers already here. And yet, at this moment now, when we see a very tight labor market, we see concern are rising wages driving inflation, people have just run to this argument that, well, if we increase immigration, that will solve this. It will loosen the labor market. It will reduce pressure on wages. And by the way, that is exactly correct. But it's a massive admission by all involved of the thing that everybody already knew, which is that at the end of the day, immigration is fundamentally an economic issue. It's many other things too, but it is an economic issue. Allowing a large number of new workers into some segment of the labor market reduces power for workers in that segment, reduces pressure to raise wages in that segment. And if you look at American public policy in recent decades, our willingness to ever expand the supply of less skilled, lower wage workers through immigration has in fact had the effect of suppressing the wages of both native workers and the immigrants who are already here. And it has a corrosive effect on inequality, I think. And it's an important piece of understanding why wages have not been growing. And conversely, it's an incredible lever available to policymakers to pull. If we want wages to rise faster for low wage workers, we have the power to say we are going to stop adding more workers through immigration to that segment of the labor market.
So take a historical view on this for me. What was the inflection point or series of inflection points in the last 100 years or whatever timeline makes sense where immigration policy really started having a distortive effect downward on wages?
It's a good question. I mean, if you think about just the general sprawl of immigration policy, you obviously had a period a century ago of very high immigration. Although interestingly, we're reaching the point where a century ago marks the flipping of that switch. Mm-hmm. The period of high immigration was really sort of 1890 up to World War I. In the aftermath of World War I in the 1920s is where the U.S. really flips its policy and much more tightly restricts immigration. That remains in force until the 1960s, when I believe it's in 1965, we significantly liberalize immigration policy. And so then we have this era, 1965 through the present, where in general, we've had a very liberal immigration policy. And then really over the last 20 or 30 years, we've had just a sort of refusal to enforce immigration law at all to some extent. And so I think it's important to note that illegal immigration is an important part of this picture, particularly because illegal immigration tends to particularly skew toward that lower end of the labor market. Legal immigration brings in a population of workers that probably skews more than ideally it should toward lower wage workers. But it's when you add on top of that the enormous number of illegal workers who are particularly corrosive to the market because they are working under the table, that I think you get these worse effects. And so on all of these issues, whether we're talking about globalization and trade, whether we're talking about the decline of labor unions, whether we're talking about immigration, I always hesitate to suggest you should do some sort of econometric analysis and, find the correlation in this year versus that year, because I think, among other things, you can run the analysis any way you any way you want, but also the way that these effects transmit are a lot more attenuated in a lot of cases. So it's not just that you sort of open up immigration and now you have more workers and therefore wages decline. It's also that if you're somebody thinking about starting a business and look around and say, oh, I'm going to have basically as much low wage labor as I want, in many cases under the table that I don't even have to follow the law with respect to, you're going to build a very different kind of business.
Right. Business models originate from an implied system where cheap low-wage labor is available.
Exactly. And so, a classic illustration of this is the construction industry, where productivity in the construction industry has actually been declining for about 50 years. It requires more labor to do the same construction today than it did in the 1960s.
And would that be because it went from sort of a higher skilled profession to sort of a brute force, just throw people at it profession, or how would you frame
I think there are a lot of things going on. I think, folks on the right will fairly say that regulation is also a big piece of it. So again, I wouldn't ever do a single factor analysis, but if you compare to what you might hypothetically have expected, if you had a tight labor market, if you had to pay good wages, if you were focused on developing skills in the workforce, you would expect productivity to be growing at 1-2% a year. That would easily outweigh any sort of regulatory issues. And so you should expect to be twice as productive today. And so the fact that instead the approach that the industry has clearly taken is, well, we'll just find more not especially skilled labor when we need it. Again, you're not going to find that in your econometric analysis of, well, when did more immigrants enter which regional market and so forth. But you are going to see it in just a massive loss in good high wage jobs and productivity for the society generally. And so, what I would say broadly to actually answer your question, I think what you see is that we had, as with so many areas of policy, an economy and a labor market in the, post World War II up until 60s or 70s era that was focused on tight labor market, assumed that higher wages are a good thing, and built the most prosperous middle class in the world. And then you have an era from roughly 1970 to the present where we flipped to this idea that we just want as much cheap stuff as possible. And therefore, in effect, workers and work are just a commodity like wood or oil. And the more and cheaper it is, the better. And that is reflected in lots of policies, but certainly immigration is one of them. And I think we see the results in the economy all around us.